There has been a lot of talk about healing and healing commanders in Rise of Kingdoms, and today I will be making a guide on healing, discussing why there is a lot of, stigma around healing commanders and the idea that healing is instantly bad, how healing actually works, and when healing is bad and when healing can actually be good for you, because healing is not all bad. Sometimes healing can actually benefit your marchers. So if you want to know more about healing and actually have an in-depth, proper, well-researched perspective, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now, I think the first thing we should do when it comes down to looking at healing is discussing how it works, and just quickly giving a simple analysis of how healing will actually work in a combat situation. I think there is really almost no better way to show this than just attacking something with a healing commander. And the way that healing works is obviously it's going to bring back a portion of your units. When you heal, you will get back some number of troops depending on the commander's heal strength. Now, heal strength usually just comes in the form of healing factor. With the new archers, it's a mighty heal, which I don't actually know the difference. I know there is a difference, but I don't know the exact difference. And it can also be boosted by things like the circle formation and other healing things. But the way healing works is whenever a commander heals, they're only healing a certain type of unit. They're not healing every single unit. They're not going to heal dead troops, and they're not going to heal severely wounded units. So as you can see here, Richard is healing. He healed 3,089 troops, and Boudica's passive skill healed another 1,700. So that is really simply him healing back slightly wounded units. So whenever you fight in Rise of Kingdoms, you're going to get some number of slightly wounded units on your march, but you're not going to be able to heal your severely wounded units, which you'll also get in Rise of Kingdoms. So whenever you're fighting, you're going to get severely wounded and you're going to get slightly wounded units. Healing is only going to help you recover those slightly wounded units. And that means any severely wounded units you get will still go to your hospital and they're not going to heal. So as you can see here, there are 48 Royal Guards. They are all from the Richard March since I didn't use any before. So really, healing is a way to bring back slightly wounded units, and the way that's going to work is if you have, let's say, 170,000 troops and you heal 4k, you'll go up to 174,000, but none of those will be severely wounded units. They're all going to be slightly wounded units that are brought back into combat, because the way that combat works is as turns pass, as you can see here, these white numbers and the active skills that you take will give you some number of slightly wounded and some number of severely wounded units, sometimes dead if you're attacking garrisons or a full hospital. And those units cannot be brought back without just going to your hospital and paying resources to heal them. But slightly wounded units are the ones that you take them to your city and you're able to pretty much fully recover them literally for free. So let's say here, Ethelfled, 1,000 slightly wounded units. When she goes to my city, those slightly wounded units will be put back into my normal troops, and it's not actually going to do anything. So they just cost nothing, and that is what healing is going to bring back. They don't heal severely wounded, they don't heal deads, they only heal slightly wounded units. Now, you may be wondering why then is healing bad? It's just going to give you more troops, which should make you stronger, right? But this is where the problems with healing do come in, and this is where, of course, I'm going to talk about the issues with healing. And the first real issue with healing is the fact that when you're losing, it's going to make you take a horrible trade. Once you get a wounded unit or a slightly wounded unit in Rise of Kingdoms, that unit is out of combat. It cannot be severely wounded. There's no way to severely wound a slightly wounded unit until it returns to your city, with one exception. Whenever a commander heals, they're going to bring those slightly wounded units back, which obviously means you'll get more troops in your march, which can be good, and we'll talk about that later. But it does mean that you can take, again, that unit and make it severely wounded, which is why sometimes you can see something like a Richard report, which I don't really have one on me, but you may be able to find a Richard report, often a Richard versus Richard in KVK1, where the severely woundeds are ridiculous. Both sides have like a 220,000 march capacity, and then they'll both get like 100,000 severely woundeds, which just sounds insane. And that's because Richard, both of them are going to be constantly healing back their troops, and then those troops can become severely wounded again, and it's just going to constantly go back and forth. So in those situations, healing can really drive your trade into a really negative situation, especially if it's a long drawn out 1v1 type battle. Healing can be a dangerous thing if you are losing the fight. Same thing in the open field. In a bigger open field sense, generally this won't happen as much because most commanders heal on an active skill, and if you make a mistake in a big open field murder ball, your march is just going to get decimated, whether or not it heals. So maybe you might get an extra 500 to 1,000 sev wounds from healing there, but it's not going to be a 20 to 30,000 sev wound difference like it can be in a long drawn out situation. So that's one real big negative, probably the biggest negative really, is the fact that you bring back slightly wounded units, and when you're losing, you are going to take a lot more sev wounds and take a lot more damage, and it's just not going to be very fun for you. So in those situations, healing can be a little bit bad for you. It also, well, not a little bit, it can be a lot bad. And of course, it does mean you might have a bigger hospital bill at least, depending on how many troops you heal or how many extra sev wounds you do receive. So that is really the main downside to healing compared to many other forms of damage protection like shielding or just normal damage reductions. So now that we've really talked about the main reasons why healing is bad, what about the situations where it can be actually a good thing? And there are some times, I think there are a few more situations nowadays that healing is actually better than it would be in a bad situation. And the first way that healing can be good is if you are winning a fight. If your march is in a winning situation, healing is going to bring back your slightly wounded units. And yes, that means you are going to most likely get more sev wounds from those slightly wounded units. But if you're winning, it means you're going to have more troops in your march, and therefore you're going to do more damage. It's quite simple as that, and that's why sometimes you can see reports of a healing commander coming back. They might actually lose a trade sometimes and still win a battle. That time, it might have been about a fair fight or you were losing a bit, but sometimes you'll see a commander that heals that just wins by an exponential amount. They've still got 30, 40, 50,000 troops left in their march after a full 1v1 into the ground. And the reason is, when it comes down to healing, if you're winning, it's really going to help you win a lot more, purely because you're able to gain more troops in your march and therefore deal more damage to your opponents. It is a really, really important thing in those situations when you're winning, that healing can make you really, really strong. It can really bring your marches up to standard to a lot of other more powerful commanders. And the reason that often healing gets looked down upon is the commanders that had healing back in the day were not very good. I mean, you have commanders like Richard, who's in long, drawn-out battles where their sev wound numbers are stupidly high. You've got commanders like Constantine, who just don't do any damage and all they do is tank, and they've just got massive healing that's just going to make them take a lot more severely wounded units. But nowadays, you can see some commanders who are a bit better with healing. I think the key example would be the two new Archer commanders. A lot of people are very much not interested in Chiyo Jung purely because of the fact that he does do healing. And I don't think that's a fair assumption to give, purely because even though he might do healing and it could give you a bigger hospital bill when you're losing, whenever you're winning, you're going to get a much better trade. So it's a bit of a risky move to do, obviously, but it means he has a lot of field potential, and he's not just a bad commander because he requires healing. Same thing obviously with Shajar. Of course, she can be run as a primary commander and you don't need to worry about the healing factor, and you can just run her normal damage factor, but healing on her can be beneficial, and we've noticed from reports that I've personally seen, Shajar as a secondary to a Chiyo Jung primary tends to do a little bit better than Shajar as the primary. And by a little bit, I mean quite a big margin. So when it comes down to this mighty healing and these healing effects, they are actually good for the march, purely because when you look at it, these commanders are going to get a better trade if they are winning. They're just going to get an even better trade. It means you can milk your opponents for even more sev wounds. And even on the open field, in a general open field sense, healing I think is overall a bit more beneficial because you hopefully won't mess up as many times as you get a good trade, especially when it comes down to using archers, and this is a bit of a side tangent. If you play them correct and you play them a bit slower, you are going to get a lot more positive trades. You're going to be less risky, which means you won't end up in a situation where your march just gets banged and killed instantly. So in those situations, mighty healing and healing in general could be pretty good for you. It can help you recover stuff like things you took from AoE damage, and it can also help you just gain more units to deal more damage to another opponent. So mighty healing can be good in those situations if you use it right. Obviously, though, it can still do what I said before. It can still have a negative. Healing is really good when you're winning, but it is really bad when you're losing. So do keep that in mind. It's not like just because you can win, the commanders will become magically overpowered. If you are losing, the healing is really going to screw you over, which is why a lot of people do tend to steer away from it. Another thing when it comes down to healing is the fact that it is really good in a garrison and a rally situation. In those situations, usually you want to just hold something. If you are garrisoning, let's say maybe a pass like our enemies are doing right now, your main goal is just to hold that pass if you're being fully realistic. You just want to keep that pass and you just want to make sure that no one can steal it. You don't care if it means you get a slightly negative trade, and that's why healing is really good. And I mean, this is undeniable in this situation. Healing for this is powerful purely because when it comes down to it, when you look at previous garrisons, healing garrisons tend to be very strong. Zenobia is a really bloody old garrison, and she is still, well, not nowadays, she's not amazing, but she was really good for, I want to say, 3 to 4 years after her release, which is insane for a garrison commander, purely because she's such a healing and tanky heavy commander, and healing does allow commanders to be much tankier. That's why, like when I was talking about Richard duels last ages. I've seen a Richard duel, I think, go on. It was 2 Richards fighting. I think it was Richard and Martel on both sides. It was some dumb number, like 7 or 8 minutes, just constantly hitting each other back and forth. Not like they were regenerating, obviously, from healing, but they weren't putting more troops in their march. They were just fighting back and forth, and it ended up in pretty much a equal trade. It was a ridiculously high amount of Sev wounds, but it is an example of why healing can make you much tankier and make you stronger in situations where you need it. So that's why a garrison with healing is good. That's why a rally with healing, even though we don't really see them, can be pretty decent. So Chia Yong, good example. As a garrison, you just want to keep it alive. Healing is going to make you much tankier at the cost of more Sev wounds or more dead. So if you really need to hold something, healing commanders are really good garrisons in those situations, and they are definitely not something that should be neglected or forgotten about. So now that we've really looked at the pros and cons of healing and how healing actually works, the last thing we should kind of look at is when should you use healing and when shouldn't you use healing, or what types of healing are going to be the better types. And the first thing I'll talk about is when you shouldn't use healing. Never ever really use a healing commander or rely too heavily on a healing commander in 1v1s. 1v1ing with healing is much more risky than just doing a normal open field situation because, like I said, with Richard as the example again, you can get a ridiculous amount of Sev wounds if you end up losing. It's a dumb number. You can get 10 to 20,000 more Sev wounds than you would have if you weren't using a healing commander. So if you're doing 1v1s, I'd recommend steering clear of them if possible. If you really think you can win, they can be exponentially powerful and really help you. And then if you think you're going to lose, obviously, I wouldn't be running those healing commanders. Another time is if you're doing just a general thing like a garrison swarm, especially, like if you're swarming down a garrison or just general swarming of something that's stronger than you, like a city, a garrison, or rally, try and steer away from healing units again, because if you are, and you most likely will be losing that trade, the healing is going to make you take a lot more damage, especially when you're swarming down garrisons, whether it be flags, passes, cities, whatever it is. Don't use healing commanders there because it's just going to make you take a ton of Sev wounds for absolutely no reason, because those garrisons are going to be packing 2 million units. You'll be happy to pack like 3 to 400,000 if you're a bigger account. So I wouldn't recommend healing in those situations. If you're a mega whale and you just don't care and you just want to destroy that garrison, healing can work, sure, you'll just be tankier, but I just don't recommend it. It's going to be a bit expensive and a bit risky, especially if they just let you swarm it out and they're not swarming you back. So if they're just filling the rally and letting you swarm a garrison or whatever and you're running healing commanders, you're going to take way more saves than you would if you didn't run a healing commander. The last thing I'd talk about when it comes to not using healing commanders is using healing commanders who don't really benefit from the heal, and the main thing they do is just healing. So Shajar is not a good example of this, nor is Chia Yong. They're commanders who benefit from their healing because they do a lot of damage from it. Their main damage source is through their mighty heal, and their mighty healing factor actually helps them deal damage. But commanders like Richard, who their main gimmick is healing, they're not a good choice. So if Lilith chooses to release more of these, which I doubt they will, but if they do, I wouldn't be running these healing type commanders. They're just going to give you Sev wounds because the healing isn't really achieving a goal. These commanders will barely win a trade nowadays, obviously, and even back then, they are really good back then, but that was in a different meta. So if there's a lot of commanders who just rely on healing, especially for the field, they're most likely a commander you shouldn't be using or running because you will just take a lot of damage, unless the commander is able to deal damage based on their healing, like Shajar and like Chia Yong. They are a commander you should not be running on the field in those situations because you are just going to literally bring back slightly wounded units for no benefit of your own, unless you are winning a trade, which is unlikely if you're not dealing much damage. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is when you should use healing. We spoke about garrisoning and rallying. Healing is good. An open field when you're winning, healing can be nice, and that's why I like the Shajar with Chia Yong combo. The healing damage, while it can give you more Sev wounds in some situations, will often allow you to deal more damage and give your opponents more Sev wounds. I've seen seen some pretty decent reports of this March. I haven't seen too many. It's quite rare to find an expertise Chiyoung with a Shajar or someone that's willing to run both on the field. Often one's in a garrison, or both of them are in a garrison, but to my knowledge, it looks like a very decent field march. So I don't see why this would be a must-skip option. Obviously, this isn't my number one invest. Go and get Chiyoung. It wouldn't make 100% sense, but it would be a not very bad option, purely because the healing is going to be beneficial in these situations because this is a strong march, and it should be winning most of the battles it's doing. So if you're winning, healing is very good. Obviously, the other situations would be stuff where you just don't want to die. So if you still play, let's say, Champions of Olympia, healing is good. I don't even know if that's still around because I just don't play it. Or if you're doing Sunset or Lost Canyon, healing is really good in those situations as well. So in those situations, healing is very decent and something you should consider. And it can be very powerful on the field if you're in a winning situation or your march is just generally stronger than most of your opponent's marches. So if you've stacked up your healing march, or your, let's say, again, Chiyoung with Shajar, if it's stacked up with equipment, it can definitely be a pretty good march to run because that healing is just going to be exponentially better for you and allow you to get even more value from running that march. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, I just want to ask you guys for a small favor, and that is consider subscribing to the channel. I try to make interesting guides about common things that are talked about in Rise of Kingdoms, and one that I've just seen a lot recently was healing. So if you want to talk a little bit more about healing and the way that healing works in Rise of Kingdoms, you're just interested in more stuff about healing and healing commanders, or even just the general future releases of commanders, I like to try and keep up to date with all that, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Also, as a side note, there may be some stuff here that was wrong, so if someone can point out anything that was wrong in today's video, I'll pin the comment, because obviously, if I've messed something up, I want people to know, so tell me in the comments if I messed something up. Obviously, don't be rude about it. I always get comments like, you're a stupid idiot, you did something wrong. If I said something wrong, let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to pin a comment if it is correct. I'll, again, do my research and double check. So if I said something wrong, please do let me know in the comments. I'm interested to see. But to my knowledge, healing is not always bad, and that was the main reason I made today's video. Other than that, I just want to say thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.